was in Monahan, and I wrote a book, and I'm here tonight to talk about it. My book was published by a firm called Arcadia Publishing. They are in South Carolina. They do books like this all over the country, and that's why you see past and present books from places like Camarillo and Williamsport and Sedalia. Maybe you've never heard of those towns. I promise you, those people have never heard of Walla Walla either. They have a particular strategy for choosing the books. First, they find a town. How do they find a town? How did they find Walla Walla and know that it was a candidate for this series? I had this vision. They Googled charming town, interesting architecture, Washington State, and then Walla Walla showed up. And that doesn't surprise us because, of course, it would. Then they find an author. Once they have a town, they put their feelers out and contact people and say, do you know anybody who would be willing to do this book? The person who ended up recommending me was Mike Denning, bless his heart. So they did indeed find an author. Then they request a sample. So maybe, they've heard this is a charming town with interesting architecture. And they've heard that maybe you can write about it, but you have to send in a pretty extensive sample to convince them, which I did. And then you work out a contract. They do not pay. They do not pay up front. What they do is give an author a particular part of the royalties. And I, from the very beginning, decided that anything that I earned from this book would go to my local museums. So it is essentially a fundraiser. But you still sign a contract, and you still have lots and lots of deadlines. Now, mind you, this is 2020. So signing a contract at the beginning of a pandemic, when you may not be able to go anywhere you need to go to get information, is a little scary. But there was some, some provisions in it to account for that possibility. They have very, very strict guidelines. For instance, their image quality for both their past photos and their present photos must be very, very high. Plus, they have very specific text limitations, so that you are restricted to 75 to 80 words about every building or site you write about. I saw that and I was dismayed. I said, no. You don't understand. I've been writing about these buildings for years, and some of them are like my best friends. I couldn't possibly describe them in 75 to 80 words, but I had to. So that was something that I just worked with within their confines. "80 pairs of photos, past and present photos, with sort of sandwiched in between a caption of 75 to 80 words. Those were my requirements. Where did I go to get my information? Well, go is an interesting word because who's going anywhere, as you remember, in 2020? But the sources that I got would be, first of all, actually one of my best friends is the city directories. Now, we have a complete collection at the public library. We have a complete collection at Whitman College Archives, and we have a complete collection at Fort Walla Walla Museum Library, or maybe not complete, but a lot there. Plus, Whitman College Archives puts a lot of directories online, which is extremely helpful when you are stuck in your living room and doing your work. For instance, any of us can go to Whitman College Archives and download directories from 1880 all the way to 1910 and have them on our computer. Very useful. If you are Ancestry.com members and subscribe, you can also get directories online with them. They're clunky. They're clunky to use, but like I said, when you're stuck at home, you're pretty grateful. And our friends Walla Walla 2020. My friend Steve Lean is a member of that organization. Absolutely tremendous people with lots and lots of resources. Who's been to wallawalla2020.net's website? Because if you haven't, go there. There's tremendous, tremendous information there. For instance, an interactive map that shows you all the properties, homes, and businesses that for which complete reports exist, many of them written by Steve.
A few.
Quite a few. Very, very helpful and very helpful to me as an historian. Plus, I don't know, many of you are probably familiar with these wonderful downtown and historic home walking maps. Not really available anymore, but they are. If you go to wallawalla2020.net, you can download your own. And each one of those little points has a little blurb that goes with it that tells you all about the house that you are walking by. My friend Joe Drazen couldn't exist without him. He doesn't just have photos, but he has a lot of photos. He also has pamphlets and articles from newspapers and artifacts. For instance, one of my homes is the Ben Road home. I go to Joe Drazen's website and I enter Ben Road as a search item. And what do I find? I find a whole newspaper article with their home featured. I find farming photos of Mr. Grote, farming his wheat, and the concrete silos for which he is famous, all on Joe Drazen's website. And that helps me. I can't use all those pictures in my book, but it helps me in terms of what I now know about Ben Grote. Ancestry.com. Are there some Ancestry.com subscribers out here? I just couldn't exist without them. I look up Ben Grote in Ancestry.com and I find out where in a particular year he is living, how many family members he has, whether or not he has a servant. I'm always interested in the domestics in any of our grand homes. In this case, I even found their marriage certificate, which was fascinating too. I can't use it in my book. I remember those space requirements I got, those limitations, but I certainly can use it in terms of what I now know about the Grote family, and it helps me to write my caption. Up to the Times magazine is an incredible resource. A complete collection at our public library, a complete collection at Whitman College Archives, and quite a few here at Fort Walla Walla Museum and Library. And within Up to the Times, I found indeed a great article about Ben Grote.
Susan,
Yes.
could I make one comment? That the New York Public Library subscribed to Up to the Times magazines and they've put them online.
That is
From
true.
the beginning only up to 1921, 22, something like that. They don't have them for every single year.
But very close.
Resource.
If you go to Whitman College Archives, they have all the Up to Times magazines from 1904 when they began to 1910, and then they have the link to the New York Public Library, that's recent, where you can go and then get even more access. Wonderful resource. Thanks, Steve. And then my total favorite is newspapers online. This costs nothing, absolutely nothing. It's through the Library of Congress, the Walla Walla Washington Statesman, Walla Walla Statesman and Evening Statesman are all available to all of us, and it's searchable. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource, all the way from 1864 to 1910, with a gap between 1884 and 1904 for reasons I don't understand. That's the way it is. And within, when I go to that search, and I search the newspapers, I find fascinating stuff. I find out that Bessie Grote had her appendix out. That's not probably too useful to me. That's one of the articles. And then Mr. Grote and his wheat and his yield, okay, and his elevators. I'm learning more about him. Also, a fascinating fact. The article all the way over to the right tells about when Ben and Bessie eloped. Bessie's parents were also farmers, and they had a farmer picked out for her, and she wasn't interested. She wanted to marry Mr. Grote. They eloped, got married in the Catholic Church, and lived happily ever after. Couldn't use that in my book, but I was really interested to find it out. Penny Andres' book, I suppose a lot of you have seen them, maybe own them. Wonderful resource for homes. My book has homes, businesses, public organizations, churches, and schools. Penny Andres' books are just homes, but a wonderful, wonderful resource. Incredible research she did. When you go to the next AAUW book sale, look for them, because they are few and far between and very, very precious and very, very useful. And last, Mountain View Cemetery. It is appropriate that it would be last. I looked up Ben Grote at the cemetery, and sure enough, found him there. Finally, after all that research and all those resources, I'm ready to write a caption. And I'm ready to do my 75 to 80 words. I knew I was writing this a lot for locals. I realized that. And I knew that a lot of people here in Walla Walla are going to be familiar with buildings. So my goal was in the book for people even who knew buildings well, our buildings well, to be looking through that book, reading the captions and saying, I didn't know that. Or, that's a surprise. I wanted to provide surprises and new information. This was a team effort. Yeah, there's me, and there's certainly my friend Steve Willeen, my photographer, but also my husband Mark, who read all those captions, every bit of text I've ever written. He has read and approved and made suggestions. And then my friend Jean McMenemy, who was willing to do a lot of scanning for me. Okay, so here I am with this book and my limitations. What I did not have space to include, more details and more photos. And that's why we're here tonight. And that's why I have borrowed Paul Harvey's phrase, and now for the rest of the story. And most of us out here know who I am talking about. Do you know? How did I choose my subjects? How did I choose out of all these wonderful buildings and places in Walla Walla? Well, first of all, I said, does it have interesting architecture? Is there an interesting story connected with it? Is there an historic image available? This is crucial. Absolutely crucial. Can't do it without a historic image. Well, what about those historic images? Where do I get them? Yes, it's a pandemic. And yes, I am absolutely not allowed to go to Whitman College Archives, which Steve and I sometimes call our home away from home. We couldn't go there. I could not go there and do any research. So what do? I looked at lists that they had on their website, and if something looked promising, I would write to Dana, the lovely woman there, who is assistant archivist, with Ben Murphy, who is the head archivist, and I said, could you please look up these buildings for me? We would have a Zoom meeting, and one by one, she would hold them up and say, what do you think about this one, Susan? Sometimes I'd say yes, sometimes I'd say no. If it worked, she scanned it, she sent it to me. And it was not as good as being there, but it was certainly better than not being able to use the archives at all. Fort Walla Walla Museum did allow me to use their library. I was masked and I was distanced, but I was able to come in. And they have lots of wonderful photos, one of which is one of my very favorites, which is on the back of the book and featured in the book of the McDonald's livery stable. And they were also very willing to send me and scan for me and incredibly kind. They also have a wonderful selection of up-to-the-times magazines. And the beauty about their magazines is that many of them are unbound, so you can lie flat on a scanner. Then there's Steve's postcard collection. Couldn't have done it without him. Steve, you want to talk a little bit about your postcard collection?
Well, let's see, that's only 6 of the boxes in that. Oh, I'm almost afraid to touch this.
That's going to be annoying.
That's only, can you hear me? Yes. That's only 6 of the boxes. I'm working on the 9th now, and I have no idea how many postcards there really are.
It's a problem.
Yeah, it's a compulsion. I actually was not serious starting to collect them when I moved here in 2006. Started out mostly with Walla Walla postcards, but also I'm one of those people. I came here from Seattle where I grew up, and so I've got an awful lot of postcards from Seattle as well. And the interesting thing about postcards is they tend to show the building or the home, or the subject matter, I should say, maybe a little bit differently than a normal professional photograph would. And collectors tend to like them if they're unposted. But to me, I enjoy the posted ones just as much. There were what I would call, you all know what, you're all old enough to know what pen pals are. I don't think they exist anymore. But there used to be postcard pals. They were usually women, and there must have been clubs of women. And a woman in Walla Walla would buy a postcard of a building here and send it to her Aunt Bessie in Des Moines, Iowa. And Aunt Bessie would say, you sent me that one last time, please don't send it again, but I would like one of such and such. So, what else was I going to say about postcards?
Where do you get most of them?
Well, frankly, here I get most of them online. eBay, of course, is a wonderful resource for postcards. And there are several other dealers online who sell them. But like most things that I've collected in my life, the price is not coming down. Up and up and up. So I'm going to have to find a new thing to start collecting. I found a postcard of the water tower in Volunteer Park in Seattle. A common postcard. $700. They're on eBay.
Better stick to Walla Walla. Who scanned all these postcards for me? It was my friend Jean McMenemy. Thank you, Jean. Sometimes I got so fortunate because a homeowner would actually have a historic photo of a home, like my friend Penny. I was told by a neighbor, Sherry, who used to own Penny's property, that photo existed. So I made a new friend, and she shared that photo with me. She took it out of the frame, and Jean scanned it, put it back in the frame, and it's wonderful. That's the original owner with his 2 little daughters after he just built the house. Another great story about homeowners is the Russells, Julia and Roger, who had the Baumeister Mansion off Stone or Edward, I'm not sure what the address is, it's actually off of 2nd. And they had a huge photo album from the Baumeister family, who were very, very wealthy people and loved to take pictures. Postcards, there's a real variety of them, as you can see. just so subtle and lovely, and I had many of them. Jean scanned them all for me with their beautiful colors. Arcadia looked at them and said, oh, if it's in color, it doesn't look old enough. So they made them all black and white. Another example, the Market Street House postcard. Beautiful scene at Whitman College. There used to be a trend, apparently, if you were wealthy enough, and perhaps vain, you would have a photograph taken of your house and a postcard made of it. And that was the case with the Baumeisters. So that is an actual postcard of their home that they could send to all their friends and show them where they lived. Of course, beautiful old photos like the Central Christian Church. And Martin's funeral home, would you recognize it? Isn't it just wonderful, dripping with all that ivy? Sometimes there's no photo, there's no postcard, and there's a building that I just desperately wanted to include. I knew, for instance, that there were 2 buildings surrounding this 1889 bird's eye map that exists at Whitman College, and I said, I just have to have it. I have to have them. So, bless her heart, Dana, they must have the biggest scanner in the world. I've never seen it. Scanned that whole map for me, so I was able to get the Baumeister building and the house on Catherine Street, the Colonel Parker home. And you can see from that engraving how accurate it was and how clear. And those are details we never would have known about had it not been for that map. And wouldn't it have been a shame not to include this beautiful house on Catherine Street? And I couldn't have it had they not allowed me to use a couple of those engravings. Now, taking the present photos. We got past photos, that was my job. We got text for captions, that was my job. But I needed a photographer for all the present photos. So I said to my friend Steve, well, I'm doing this project, and it's for Arcadia Publishing, and they're not paying me anything. And if I get any royalties, I'm giving them to museums. So it's essentially a volunteer project, and I need a photographer. And he said, you really did say this, he said, I'd love to. Oh. He's going to tell us a little bit about his experiences doing so.
I don't remember saying that. I remember saying my knees are really bad. Well, Susan was limited to 80 words. I had a few limitations placed too. 80 words per photo. Arcadia insisted on the new photo being taken from the very precise location that the original was taken from. My favorite one was the Pantorian building, 2nd and Rose. The original photo was taken when there were maybe 30 cars in Walla Walla and a few horses. I had to stand out in 2nd and Rose off the curb. Now, you know, traffic zips by that intersection. It was, and the other thing about that particular photo is another one of the requirements, they don't allow photoshopping. Now, I know there are 2 schools of thought about photoshopping. But my God, there are a lot of overhead wires and 2nd Avenue and Rose. Although I'm actually rather thankful that I didn't have to Photoshop them out. It would have taken me 6 months. Other ones, well, they were, I had to stand in the street in places, but on Main Street that wasn't such a problem because most of the traffic on Main Street is moving between 2 and 3 miles an hour because everyone is looking for a parking spot.
And in this case, he had almost like too many choices. He had 3 great postcards, but then you go to the actual place and you say, well, which angle is going to work?
Yes, Susan and I, we really both like the one on the left, but there are evergreens there. Evergreens don't shed leaves, which brings me to the other subject. You really... Okay, yes, I wasn't paying attention to the photos. The Ritz Mansion. I went out and photographed that by myself, a beautiful photograph. Susan sent it to the owner, and she said, oh, I wish I'd known you were coming, because I would like, the shades were pulled down, I'd like to have the shades on. So we had to go back and re-photograph that. This is Colonel Parker's house on Catherine Street. I tried to duplicate the perspective and the drawing that Susan showed you a moment ago appeared to be a little bit elevated. So we had to lug a ladder from Susan's house down the street, and I'm quite thankful that a horse did not come galloping down the street as I was standing. My knees really are right there.
I got carried away, sorry.
Now that is a good example of how easy it was to photograph on Main Street, though I do think it was about 5 o'clock in the morning.
And during a pandemic.
During a pandemic. And this one I just had as a pet. You know, there is a barber shop there. And I don't know how many of you have noticed, but there's this awful looking skull on one of the windows, a bearded skull advertising the barber shop. We wanted to get that out. Well, I took 2 pictures. I don't recall what those metal objects are right next to the skull, but I kneeled down and I managed to get the skull completely out of the frame. Susan sent in the wrong photograph.
It's not that much.
Now some houses, because of shrubbery, I mentioned a moment ago that photos look better if they're taken when foliage is out, but that doesn't always work. In the case of the Ward House, not only has it been turned 90 degrees from the way it looked in that photograph, but you can only see the top of it now on the street. I do like that photo. I'm going to use that somewhere.
And remember, it's not like you could go through that hedge and take a picture, because the guidelines meant it had to be from the same angle.
And this is a beautiful house. I don't see Lee Coleman here, but some of you may know Lee Coleman. She's lived in that house for many, many years on Birch, just a little bit south of the United Methodist Church. But that's the best I could do. So that had to be eliminated. And this, the old chapel from McCall Hospital, which is now at the Veterans Center, Wainwright. You've seen it from Alder Street. And Susan wanted to include it, and so we went out one rather gray, ugly day. And it got uglier, so we scrapped that one.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Okay. Our visitors from Seattle, you know the ones, we call them the wine weekenders. They come to our town and they look at the buildings and they say, oh, it's just beautiful. Look how they've preserved all their buildings. They look just as they used to. Nothing has happened over time. And of course, we know better. We know there's always an in-between. I call this restoration sometimes, and sometimes Steve calls it remodeling. Because it's not totally successful. The ones I want to show you are Reynolds Day, Kirkman House, Baumeister Building, Oddfellows, and the Roberts Monument buildings in terms of the in-between awkward age. The Reynolds Day, 1874. An old, nice old print. Looks perfect. Look at it now. It looks the same. What's the big deal? Well, some of you might remember. How about when it looked like this? Behind that green facade is a beautiful and wonderful historic building. Well, how did it get fixed up? Well, the Falkenbergs took on a grant and they took on a huge project to make this happen, bless them. And my friend Rob Robinson was in charge of the project, so he contributed a lot of the photos for the restoration, which is real helpful. There's another stage. Getting better. Can you imagine how long and arduous? Sometimes it looks like they had nothing to work with. And then little bits of architectural details would surface. And then it looks just as it should. Yay is right. Yeah, just as it should. Henrietta's Playhouse. It was built in 1903 for that little girl standing on its porch. There she is. I'm not going to say Henrietta Baker was spoiled, but she was not denied much. Was she in the Baker family that we know? Yes, she was indeed a granddaughter of Dorsey Baker. Her dad was Henry Baker, and she lived in a beautiful mansion, which is now gone, on Crescent Street. We have that drawing, and that beautiful little playhouse was behind that mansion. However, when her house got raised and she grew up and her parents moved on, what happened to her playhouse? Well, the family moved it up Mill Creek for a while, and I've been told it was, for a while, a chicken house and storage. And then somebody got the bright idea that this is a pretty charming little place, and the family, bless them, donated it to Fort Walla Walla Museum, where it was moved, also with a legacy to maintain it, which is a pretty fine thing. Put it in place in the Pioneer Village. And as I said, it looks just as it should. The DeBrook Building. Another one that I personally take for granted. I arrived in 2009 and I said, what a charming and wonderful old building. And it was indeed. Look at it, even later. It was built just around the turn of the century, but look at how it looked even in the 20s and how it looks today. Lovely. Another 20s photo showing all the wonderful architectural features. Keep your eye on that wonderful column right at the front, right at the corner. Watch that, because it's going to disappear. Who was around during this era? Okay. Did you have any idea what was behind there? I don't know that we could. It's about to get worse, so brace yourself. It's like every year they said, what more could we cover up? What more could we obscure? And I know there were a lot of people that had a lot of affection for the book nook and the way it was, but behind there was a building that was really crying out to come back. And it didn't. And there we have it. Kirkman House, another kind of happy story with a lot of awkward stuff in between. Built in the 1880s, but in the 1920s, Isabella Kirkman, a widow, gave it to Whitman College. They used it for a dormitory for a couple of years, and then they sold it to an apartment owner. The first apartment owner was Ruth Barnett Bench, and she named her apartments after her family name. And it was that apartment for many, many years, and other apartments for many, many years. And then in the 1940s, some cabins from the Civilian Conservation Corps camp were moved in for more apartment rentals. Even though Isabella had furnished it very beautifully, very graciously when she lived there, watch this room. During the apartment era, this is how it looked. This was the parlor apartment. This was the nice one. This is the one where the manager lived, Matilda Woodruff. More photos from the apartment era. And this is what the fine people who decided to restore it in the 1980s were confronted with. That's the dining room. Wallpaper uncovered, wallpaper replaced. The lady with the lamp was retrieved, went back on the stairway. And finally today, it looks as it should, as though it's always been that way. The Baumeister building, past and present. Remember that was that engraving. Who remembers the Soakers era? Lots of us. And once again, I think people have a lot of affection for a lot of these buildings, and I can understand that. However, would you ever think those two buildings were the same one? It had been through a lot. In fact, it even expanded. It expanded next door. But in 1997, it was lovingly restored. Process, once again, arduous, tedious. It must have had some fairly seedy residents, occupants toward the end. That door there says American Detectives. It looks very film noir to me, doesn't it? But then, when it's restored, as I said, it looks like it's always been that way. Oddfellows, built in 1902, went through some hard times, but there was a group of very, very conscious people, the Art Walla people, who said, you know, that facade's beautiful. That building's going to be torn down. Let's salvage part of it and repurpose it, which they did. Every stone that was taken down was numbered, cataloged, and stored, and eventually repurposed and made into a beautiful, beautiful structure in Heritage Park. And within each window is an enameled panel representing a culture from Walla Walla. One of my favorite things in town. Robert's Monument. Who knew? Built in 1909, it was Walla Walla's first concrete building. And I met a descendant of Mr. Roberts on her 102nd birthday. And I said, I heard that that concrete building was really kind of caused a stir when it was built. She said, they almost ran him out of town. It was just too avant-garde. It's on right next to what is now the Saffron Restaurant, which used to be the Walla Walla Traction Company, the streetcar depot. Here's another photo of it. Way over on the left, you see it. And this is my favorite. We're dedicating the Columbus statue, but if you look beyond it, you can see spectators standing within the alcove of the Monument Company. I don't know at what point it got filled in and became a building, but it was so obscured for so long, I think a lot of people had no idea what was there. I certainly was one of them. But a few years ago, I was walking by and I said, what is that? Something wonderful is being revealed. What is it? What's a Robert's Because that's all that showed. So I got out my city directories and I found out that Robert's was indeed Robert's Monument and started putting together the story. Another wonderful photo of it. And that's how it looks today. Would you ever know? The example of remodeling is going to be covered by Steve because he did an extensive story, maybe some of you read it in the UB, on the transformation of the Reese Winans building to the Jones building. You want to take that, Steve?
Sure. The Reese Winans building was, well, I forgot to look up the date and my memory is gone, but it was designed by George Washington Babcock, one of the most prominent architects in town, and was certainly the showiest building. It was just dripping with Victorian gewgaws and so forth. And Babcock had moved to Walla Walla fairly recently from San Francisco, which kind of explains the exuberant architecture. And it remained in pretty decent shape until sometime in the 1940s. Let's see, that is, yeah, you can see the sort of onion dome that was capped the little tower there. The projection on the corner was removed. I had never heard why, but presumably just deterioration from weather, etc. But the real disaster happened in 1951 when the then owner determined to remodel the building. I was told by some source that it was done because the Orioles, those projections, an Oriole is like a bay, except it doesn't extend all the way down to the ground level. And on this building, they started at the second floor and up to the third floor. I was told that they had leaked rainwater and they were full of drywall problems, and so she wanted to remove them. And I don't know if that's true or not. She may just have thought remodeling the building would make it more attractive to tenants. I don't know what the occupancy rate was in 1951. That is a sad result. I suppose if you really, really wanted to stretch it, you could say, well, now it looks like Bauhaus. But I don't think so. The unfortunate thing about this, well, number one, it's on the prime corner of Walla Walla, and it is extremely ugly. They did paint it, what, 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah.
For the first time, I swear, judging the way the old paint looked, and the paint did improve the appearance slightly. But the second and more important thing about this building is it could never be returned to what it looked like. It's just all gone. It could be done by perhaps Elon Musk, but the cost would just be prohibitive. Whereas some of the other buildings, like the Baumeister and the Reynolds that had that false front on it, well, yes, they chipped or cut a lot of the ornament off of that building, but the basic building was still under that metal screen or whatever it was. And so that is why that building could be returned to what it looked like.
Kind of a sad story. Let's go inside some of these places. I'm going to go to the Baumeister Mansion and the Main Street USO and the Cropp Mansion. There's that Baumeister Mansion again with Alvina and Max and their wonderful photo albums, which had so many photos in them. And they had a box camera, so they took lots of Kodaks. We find from their album that there was a pond and woods and a barn and horses. And inside, it's so fun for me always to see their furnishings. There's Alvina. Her daughter, Charlotte, actually managed the book nook downtown, and she was an accomplished musician. There's her piano. More interior shots. How do you maintain a big house like that? Well, you do it with very likely with a Chinese domestic, which was the case in many of our mansions, kind of a favorite topic of mine. And the man who worked there, this is 2 photos of the same man. He's named Wei. His name is spelled differently different times. And in their album, they say, affectionately, he's our wonderful Chinese who worked for us for 18 years. And he featured in an Up to the Times article as a cook. He even learned to cook German dishes for Mr. Max Baumeister. The Cropp Mansion, we can go in there today because it's now a vacation rental. So we see that's Dr. J.F. Cropp. Quite the whiskers, huh? And they were red. There's Hallie Cropp, their little girl. Now, the Main Street USO, tell me if you're familiar with this at all. People out there familiar with that, Main Street USO? Well, USO, it's got to be World War II, and soldiers go there, do they not? So they did. Now, you're saying, now, Susan, I thought you were supposed to pick buildings that were interesting architecturally. This one doesn't really qualify, does it? That's a pretty nondescript building. But it's got a fascinating history because it was the USO for our black servicemen and servicewomen who were serving at the air base. Well, why did they name their own USO, you ask? In Pasco, they had a USO for the black and the white soldiers together. But they came and they looked around Walla Walla and they found so many instances of intolerance, they decided it would be safer to have separate USOs. They brought in a gentleman named Julian Bell, who managed the USO. And you know, they also, of course, had one for the white servicemen on Alder Street. It then later became American Legion and has been raised. At the air base, there was also segregation. This is way down at the bottom of the air base map. I was looking and looking and looking. I looked in the legend to see if I could see anything about segregated quarters. Not in the legend of the map, but when I looked down way at the bottom, I found 2 blocks, both with parentheses, COL, or colored. Inside was a pretty cheerful and happy place. And a good getaway for people who were not welcome in other places in Walla Walla. There was lots of festivities there. I'm not sure what the sewing classes were about. And there was a lot of photos actually with white visitors also. I promised you stories behind some of these buildings. The stories I did not tell. They wouldn't have fit in the book and they probably weren't really appropriate. One from Washington School, one from Fort Walla Walla, officers' quarters, and one from Miles Moore's mansion. Miles Moore Mansion, last territorial governor, built it in 1883. It was home for him and his family. But, and many people know this, in 2000, Stephanie Dorgan, a Whitman College graduate, bought it. She was married to a rock star named Peter Buck. And they bought the house, and they're the ones that painted it the happy colors, painted Ladybug. They divorced. And Stephanie had a club in Seattle that was open for a while, and the Crocodile, and then closed. Has anybody ever been to the Crocodile? Oh, hell no. A young person in your audience. Really?
Yeah.
That's cool. And Stephanie still comes here from time to time. The love triangle at Washington School. Stella and Effie King were both teachers all over the district, really, and with the Walla Walla schools. Stella and Effie King. How do I know this? Well, Stella and Effie King were the sisters of Sam King, who built my house on Thorn Street. So I have this all kind of like secret from the family members. But it's nothing terribly scandalous, so I think it's okay. Here's a picture of the whole faculty of Washington School. And in this picture, the circles, we see Richard Stafford, the principal. Up at the top is Stella King. Toward the bottom is Effie King, 2 teachers there. Well, Richard was married at that time, and he had 5 children, but his wife died. Left him with those 5 children. Richard was actually courting Effie and kind of changed his mind and started dating Stella and married her. Well, the sisters, who had been very close, stopped speaking to each other and did not talk for years. But then, Richard and Stella got divorced. Now, this is just so interesting to me. This is right in the newspaper. That it was actually he who filed for divorce and grounds of incompatibility. I personally guess it was Stella and those 5 children. I think if that was probably the real reason. Things did not work out. They were only married a couple of years. So they divorced. Well, Effie continued to teach in the school system for forever. Her specialty was penmanship, and she and her students used to win prizes. Plus, she was assigned to do the calligraphy for all the certificates around town. And it's very likely, if you have an historic certificate, it was Effie that did that calligraphy. Well, you're saying, oh gosh, Stella divorced. That just ends her career, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Not at all. After she was divorced, she kept her name Stafford because women did in those days. But she became principal of Lincoln School and had a long career with Walla Walla schools. The good news is the sisters reconciled and spent their last years at the Oddfellows' home. Then there was a servant girl episode at Fort Walla Walla officers' quarters. All these quarters had big families in them, wives and husbands and children, and as a result, they had to have domestics, didn't they? They had to have maids. And they probably would have lived in the home with the family. This particular girl made front page news in 1906. A petty spite. Army officer drives servant girl from fort. Drama. It's little Eva Beller. She's 17 years old, and she's working for Captain Howard in his home. She lives in his home. She's his servant. But she got sick, and she went back home to Milton and convalesced. And Mrs. Howard was like really missing her and kept visiting her and visiting her. When are you coming back, Eva? And Eva, oh, pretty soon. Kept putting her off. And then she did come back after 3 weeks, but she went to work in a different officer's home. She went to work for the Howards. Oh, she went to work for the Holcombs. She was happy there. But Captain Howard was not happy with the fact that she had defected. And he ordered the family who had hired her to discharge her. He wrote her a letter. He wrote a letter to Lieutenant Holcomb and told him, servants cannot be allowed to shift about in this manner. This letter was published in the newspaper. It disturbs the peace and harmony at the base. And it's prejudicial to good order and military discipline. And Eva really likes staying with the Holcombs. She liked them a lot, but she was not allowed to do so. Her father had to come from Milton and take her away, take her back home. But the newspapers weren't finished. The servant girl episode was in many issues, and the Oregonian was especially harsh. She flitted from his employ, and now Captain Howard would be forced to make his own things. And one last insult, I love this one. A military power which is able to get the better of a cook need fear nothing from the Allied hosts of decrepit Europe. I'm going to end with a little nostalgia, bits and pieces. What happens when a house gets shut down and things are auctioned off, or in the case of the White Temple Baptist Church, it's razed? Well, the baptismal font from that White Temple Baptist Church is now the hood over the stove of my friends Jean and Wayne. The beautiful sconces from the Liberty Theater, they're big. It's big. Are here at Fort Walla Walla in their collection. And a delegate desk, actually from the Reynolds Day building, is also here at Fort Walla Walla. So that's from the Territorial Convention in 1878. That's pretty extraordinary that we still have that. That's at least some of the rest of the story. But I want to end with the fact that I get nostalgic and sometimes I get bitter, and I actually mourn for buildings we've lost or that we have damaged or destroyed. But, as I said in my introduction to the book, I'm proud to live in a place where our rich history is valued, and the buildings that reflect that history are honored. And what a privilege it is to have the opportunity to share some of my favorite historic buildings with others in my book. And I thank you very much.
introduce you. I was in the store because for some reason a lot of people wanted to buy some. But Susan is a great historian and a great volunteer here and devotes a lot of time, especially to our living history program. So thank you for doing Museum After Hours.
My pleasure.